Was Elvis actually more politically aware and informed than he let on? Did Elvis privately support the Vietnam War and other conservative views, despite his public silence on political issues? Did Elvis's refusal to publicly express his political beliefs make him an enigmatic figure in American culture? The king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, was a musical icon in the 1950s, but did he ever share his political views publicly? In a time when entertainers were cautious about speaking out against the government, Elvis kept his thoughts to himself. The era of McCarthyism may have made Elvis and his peers hesitant to criticize the government for fear of backlash. However, not all entertainers stayed silent, as actor Yul Brynner defended Elvis after the Los Angeles police filmed his show in 1957. Brynner's passionate defense of Presley's rights as an artist showed that speaking out against injustice was not out of the question for some in the entertainment industry. Nevertheless, Elvis himself remained largely apolitical throughout his career, focusing on his music and performances. His refusal to engage in public political discourse may have been a strategic move to avoid controversy and alienating his diverse fan base. Perhaps Elvis believed that his music was a unifying force that transcended politics, allowing people from all backgrounds to come together and enjoy his performances. While some entertainers today are vocal about their political views, it's clear that Elvis chose to let his music speak for itself. Regardless of his personal political beliefs, Elvis's impact on the entertainment industry remains unmatched, leaving a legacy that transcends the political divide. As a young, overwhelmed man in the midst of a burgeoning career, Elvis Presley admitted to being out of touch with current events. In an article by Barton Hickman, the headline, "In a World of His Own," captured Elvis's apparent lack of awareness of political happenings. At a press conference in Miami, reporter Hickman asked Elvis about Egypt's Premier Nasser and the Suez Canal, to which Elvis replied, "Suez? Man, you're talking French to me now." When questioned about the likelihood of Stevenson being nominated at the Democratic National Convention, Elvis admitted, "Well, maybe. I keep pretty busy. I don't hardly ever get a chance to read the newspapers anymore." Similarly, he was unaware of the Stockholm-Andrea Doria sea disaster, simply responding, "Well, all I heard was there was a boat wreck." Even when asked if he knew which boat had gone down, Elvis admitted, "No, sir." A 12-year-old fan at the press conference was surprised by Elvis's lack of knowledge about the news, expressing, "Golly, Presley doesn't know anything about the news." Despite his fame and influence, Elvis's focus and attention were predominantly on his music and performances, rather than current events. His admission of being too busy to read newspapers reflected his intense dedication to his burgeoning music career. This insight into Elvis's world offered a glimpse into the whirlwind of fame that he was navigating at the time. Elvis's lack of awareness of current events was not uncommon among young adults in the late 50s, as the Vietnam War did not make current events relevant to young people until the 60s. Many people accused Elvis of being a fervent supporter of the Vietnam War, but there is no evidence to support this claim, as he never made a public statement about the war. In fact, Elvis may have supported the war privately, but he certainly did not do so in a fervent way. One could argue that Elvis's lack of public stance on the Vietnam War does not necessarily mean he was a fervent supporter of it. Some people may have assumed Elvis's support for the war from a letter he wrote to President Nixon in December 1970, where he expressed his concerns about the country. It is important to note that the letter was a private communication between Elvis and the president, so it does not necessarily reflect his public stance on the war. Elvis may have had various personal reasons for his concerns about the country at that time, which may or may not have been related to the Vietnam War. it is essential to consider the context and the private nature of the letter when trying to understand Elvis's views on the Vietnam War. Elvis, like many public figures, may have had complex and nuanced views on political issues, which cannot be reduced to simple labels like fervent supporter of the Vietnam War. Ultimately, it is crucial to approach the topic of Elvis's stance on the Vietnam War with nuance and careful consideration of the available evidence. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, once wrote a letter to President Nixon to request a federal agent's badge, after being denied through regular channels. In the letter, he mentioned talking to Vice President Agnew about his concerns for the country, including the drug culture, hippie elements, and the SDS. The SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society, was a group opposed to the Vietnam War, and Elvis's concern about them could be seen as implied support for the war, which Nixon had recently escalated. However, some speculate that Elvis may have been trying to flatter the president in order to obtain the badge he so desperately wanted. Despite his previous comments, in a press conference 18 months later, Elvis declined to share his personal views on war protesters and being drafted, stating that he was just an entertainer and would rather keep his opinions private. It's safe to say that if Elvis were alive today, he wouldn't be using his platform to advocate for political causes, as he was solely focused on entertaining and revolutionizing the music industry. He was a performer who had no interest in changing the country's political direction and remained neutral on such issues. Even though his songs like If I Can Dream and In the Ghetto touched on social issues, Elvis himself stayed clear of political activism. His influence on music and entertainment was undeniable, but he was never one to use his fame to push political agendas. Elvis Presley will always be remembered as a legendary entertainer first and foremost. Despite the fact that Elvis Presley's recordings often portrayed conservative messages, it is unfair to diminish his legacy based on his lack of vocalization on social issues. Elvis may not have written his own lyrics, but he was undeniably one of the greatest entertainers of all time. Any attempt to downplay his impact because he didn't speak out against war and other social concerns is unjust. According to Marty Lacker and Jerry Schilling, Elvis was actually quite conservative, despite the liberal views of his friends. He supported the Vietnam War, believed in a strong military and capital punishment, and opposed the ERA and abortion. Despite his conservative beliefs, Elvis was also described as very intelligent and well-read, staying informed on a multitude of subjects. It's important to recognize that Elvis's political views may have evolved over time, as suggested by Schilling's speculation that he might have become a Republican. Even though Elvis may have kept his views mostly to himself, it is clear that the label of conservative does not fully capture his political stance. As Steve Binder pointed out, many would be surprised by how liberal Elvis actually was, challenging the preconceived notions of his political leanings. Ultimately, Elvis's political beliefs were complex and multifaceted, and it is important to consider the full scope of his persona before making assumptions about his legacy.